They got problems on problems on problems on problems on problems on problems I solve them. I run through the money, the pressure be calling. Left on my blessings, I feel like I'm falling. The birdie is back, tell me I'm garbage. I'm going through something, that's why I ain't calling. Phone and progression, it's all that I wanted. The phone and affection, I summon and dub it. Cause I got problems on problems on problems on problems on problems on problems I solve them. I run through the money.
Yo, what's up everyone? It's your boy Nick from Rad Dad Builds. So in this video, I wanted to show you how I built this white oak live edge dining table, which was actually destined for the fire pit. So you're gonna want to stick around for this one. And as always, roll that intro. So I started off this project by building the base. The base really is pretty simple. It just consists of 2 gables and 2 stretchers. I started out by cutting out the material that I needed for the stretchers. You can see here that the slabs are pretty twisted, so I used my bandsaw to break them down into rough sizes. Once I'd cut all the material for the stretchers, I started breaking down the rest of the live edge slabs into smaller pieces. You can see how twisted these slabs were, which is why they were destined for the fire pit. So by breaking them down into smaller pieces will help me keep the thickness of material and get it nice and flat. Once I broke down all the material for the base, it was time to get them nice and flat. I start off this process on my jointer, where I get one flat face and then one flat edge. If you don't have a jointer, it's not the end of the world. There's many ways of getting a flat surface on a piece of wood, and I'll show you later on in this video. Once I got one flat face and one flat edge on all the material, I broke them down into consistent sizes. I then put them through my planer to get the required thickness that I wanted. I followed the exact same steps on the long stretchers. I then cut all the pieces down, oversized to a consistent length. To join all the moldable pieces together to create one big gable, I use a helping hand from my Festool domino. If you don't have a domino cutter, that's fine. You can use biscuits or even dowels. It's not even 100% necessary. I just use it to help me align my pieces when I glue them up. Because I wanted nice and thick stretchers spanning the 2 gables, I cut the oversized material that I set aside in half. That way I can glue them together, making them nice and thick. I glue them together using a pretty heavy bead of glue, and I just clamp the hell out of them. For the gables, I use the same wood glue as the stretchers, giving them a nice even, consistent bead of glue. hardest part of gluing multiple pieces together is keeping it nice and flat, so you want to keep on checking as you tighten your clamps up. It also helps if you can clamp your glued piece to something straight, like an old level. I cleaned off all the excess glue and then let them sit to dry overnight. The next day I removed the clamps. The way these live-edge slabs were dried left them with a ton of cracks. I mean, a ton of cracks. So I filled them using West Systems 105 epoxy. This epoxy is great for this application, as it gives you enough time to work with the epoxy to get them into all the little cracks, but it dries overnight. So you don't have to wait days before you can work on it. To save my sandpaper from gumming up, I scraped off as much of the epoxy as I could using this $10 Home Depot paint scraper. I cleaned off the remaining epoxy and gave all the pieces to the base a good sand in my Supermax drum sander. And I gotta say, I love this thing. Once all my pieces were nice and sanded, I cut them to size using my track saw. The final size to these gables are 28.5 inches high by 34 inches wide. I then cut my stretches to 4 inches thick using my table saw. With the help of clamps to keep my gables nice and stable. Hey, that rhymes. I did a dry run to make sure I was happy with how it's looking. Once I was happy with how it's looking, I marked out the material that I needed to cut out for the stretches. I removed the material using my super ghetto crosscut sled. This worked perfectly with a 1/4 inch dado blade. I got to remove 1/4 inch at a time by clamping the piece to the fence. I then did another dry run to find the distance that I needed in between the two gables. Once I was happy, I marked the stretches either side of the gables using a marking knife. I then squared up all those marks on the stretches. I removed all the material that needed it on the stretches using the same techniques as before. I cut the stretches to length on my miter saw. And as the stretches are pretty heavy looking, I cut an angle on all the ends using my track saw. As I want this table to be able to be fully taken down for storage or moving or whatever, For the joinery, I'm using threaded inserts. I marked out the center of each cutout of the stretchers. I then drilled a hole big enough to accept the head of the screws that I'm using with the threaded inserts. I then drilled all the way through, allowing a bit of room for wood movement. I then flipped them over and then drilled all the holes to attach the top to the actual base, using the exact same techniques as before. I then assembled the base, making sure it all fits together and it looks nice. Off camera, I drilled a hole through the stretchers into the actual gables of the base. I then bored that hole out big enough to accept the threaded inserts. I used a little bit of 5-minute epoxy to give the threaded inserts just a little bit more grab. You can now see here how it all works. I repeated these steps on all 4 corners. As the base was ready for finish, it's now time to make a start on the top. Because the slabs that I'm using for the top are wider than my jointer and my planer, I have to bring out the big guns, which is my router sled. I have a separate video on my router sled and how I build it and how I use it, which I'll link in the description down below. Once I got all the 3 pieces flat, I then filled all the cracks and the holes the same way as before, using epoxy and black dye. I then cleaned them up on my drum sander, and then jointed all the edges that needed to be glued on my jointer. Using the same techniques as I did for the base, I marked out for all the dominoes ready for the glue up. And like I said before, dominoes aren't 100% necessary, I just like to use them to help with alignment. The glue itself is strong enough on its own. Using similar techniques as before, I began to glue the pieces together. This time I had some help with some ratchet straps. This just helps clamp it nice together, as sometimes clamps are kind of awkward on live edges. You want to make sure it stays nice and flat, and if you can clamp it down to something flat, that would be great. I then let the top dry overnight. The next day I removed all the clamps and then removed all the excess glue and epoxy using my Rotex sander. As these 3 slabs are pretty wide, I used some steel C-channel to help me keep it nice and flat. I marked out the C-channel where I wanted it to go, and then using my track saw, I cut out the lines where I needed for it to sit inside the slabs. I then removed the excess in between the lines that I cut out using my 1/4" router. I'm attaching the steel C-channel using threaded inserts, using the same techniques as before. I then flip the top over and cut it to size using my track saw. Once I was happy with all the pieces, I give them all a good sand from 80 grit all the way up to 220 grit, using my orbital sander. I also clean up all the edges, including the live edge, all the way up to 220 grit. I then broke away all the sharp edges by hand. I assembled the table one last time to make sure I was happy with all the sizes, measurements and everything else. Once I was happy with everything, I flipped the whole thing upside down and put it on my bench. I made sure that the table base was center of the tabletop. And then using the same techniques as before, I drilled all the holes for the threaded inserts to attach the top to the actual base. I always use a bit of painter's tape on my drill bit to mark a depth stop, because it would suck if I drilled all the way through the top, especially at this stage. Now that everything is built and sanded, it's time to start the finish. For the first base coat, I used Osmo Oil Extra Thin. I basically, using an old paintbrush, I just layer it on nice and thick on all the pieces, and I let it sit for about half an hour letting it soak in. After about half an hour, I wipe off all the excess using a blue shop towel. I let that dry overnight and come back the next day using Osmo Oil Poly X. I spread it around using a paintbrush and then I buff it in using a white pad in my polished sander. I basically buff it till it's dry and then I remove any excess. I let that dry and then I repeat this step one more time. Once the finish had dried, I then assembled the table, make sure everything fit together nice. You can see here how well threaded inserts work, as you can take the furniture apart as many times as you like without jeopardizing the thread and the screw. And there you have it, it's complete. I'm so happy how this turned out, considering how bad the slabs looked when I first got them. Like they were destined for the fire pit. So, as always, if you had any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to ask me down below. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please like and subscribe, I would appreciate that so much. Go follow me on Instagram at raddadbuilds. And as always, stay rad, stay safe, peace.